one of the interesting things from a licensing perspective is that Azure Lighthouse has now introduced support for privileged identity management, which was something it didn't have before. And PIM normally requires the Azure AD P2 or the E5 SKU for that to happen. But because Azure Lighthouse means that a service provider, and that might be the IT department in your very large org that's managing multiple tenancies, or it might be a managed service provider that's managing multiple customers. Because it's a benefit for that service provider, and yes, it's a benefit for the end customer as well, but the identities that it's acting on for the privileged identity management are the identities from the service provider to elevate the access when they need it for that short period of time to do those privileged roles. The Azure Lighthouse team have actually released that and said, look, from a licensing perspective, we're putting the onus on the service provider to have that license. So if you're a service provider and you've got a team of 10 technicians, you can turn on PIM for them that will act through Azure Lighthouse for any of the customers that they touch. And it also means that it's not a roadblock for them to go and implement it, because they don't have to go to the customer and have this conversation about, look, you could give us admin access all the time, but if you want to do it properly and use something like PIM, then you have to pony up for the extra licenses. So they've completely removed that roadblock. And I saw that and I went, hallelujah, like it was just I'm like, yes, like I can kind of understand the mechanics, why it's a good thing from a technical perspective, but just to go, hey, look, from a business perspective, this makes more sense in terms of where we're putting that licensing ownership. I'm like, oh, I love it. Like, don't you love it when licensing decisions make sense? Like, it's so good. Yeah. Cool. Jess, do you want to intro Orin? Orin can intro himself. I'm noodling around an Eventbrite to see if we can unlock the event for some more people to join.
Oh, good. I reckon we let Orin intro himself. He'll be able to intro himself far better than I will.
Epic. Go, Orin. Who are you?
Who are you?
Well, now that
Go on, tell us.
Got no idea. My name's Orin Thomas, author of more than 40 books for Microsoft Press, principal cloud advocate at Microsoft, collector of spaceships, father of an 18-year-old that's just started a nursing degree at Monash University. I'm not sure what else you need to know.
I think that's a pretty extensive introduction. That sort of sums up. But in terms of your interest, like you've written a lot of books, what are your books on? Like, why have we invited you specifically to come and talk about hybrid?
Because I am my main book is Windows Server Inside Out. So I've written 2 editions of that, 2016, 2019. I will do the 2022 version. And probably going forward, I have written books everywhere up and down the IT Pro stack for Microsoft, right from security through to SQL, through to Exchange, through to Office 365, through to M365, through to Azure Security. There's a lot of books to the point where it's just sort of ridiculous at this point, and you just sort of say,
you know your stuff.
Well, one would hope so. I mean, I knew it. My great win with the books was that for the first 3 seasons of Big Bang Theory, they actually had 5 books of mine on the shelf of the set. And the whole idea behind that was that they wanted to make Sheldon Leonard look like they had a really good bookshelf, but they didn't want to put too many bright books. And it just turned out that the Microsoft Press books at the time went from black to red and black to blue. The black to blue were the IT Pro ones, the black to red were the developer ones. So they had a shelf behind the main couch for seasons 2 and 3. And occasionally you'd see a door shot where I occasionally tweet the picture of Leonard or someone sitting in the couch and then someone had come through the door. But if you looked, there was all these books. And I was like, I'm absolutely sure one of those is mine. Because at that time, there was only 13 books that had that colouring and 6 of them were mine. And then one day I got the screen capture and then I saw that they actually had 2 of the Windows Vista book and 3 of the SQL book. So they were building multiple copies of the same book. But the joke that I tell when someone tries to out-nerd me is that I'm such a nerd that to prove that the nerds on Big Bang Theory were nerds, they put my books on the shelf.
Okay.
He knows a bit of stuff. Jess, I've extended the sale date for the tickets on the event. So if you want to go back and ping people and tell them that they can now join through that Eventbrite link. That's something I'll watch out for next time when I publish the event. I'll just extend that end date a little bit. So Orin is my colleague. He's on the same team as I am. He's obviously down in Melbourne and I'm up in Brisbane. But one of the things that I love about having Orin on our team is that even though we're technically called cloud advocates, we talk to IT pros, and guess what? Most of our IT pros aren't just running cloud workloads, and most of our IT pros have come from on-prem backgrounds, even if they are only running cloud-only workloads, which is very, very rare. And with Orin's background of Windows Server and on-prem environments, he very much is the voice of sanity in a cloud world, against the common theory of just move everything to the cloud, it'll be fine. You can get rid of all your IT pros and turn off all your servers. And we know that in reality, it's not quite that simple. And not only just as an interim step, but for a lot of our customers as a long-term environment kind of place to be, they will be managing both on-prem and cloud workloads together. So it's a very passionate topic. Orin, we just had an event recently, our team, didn't we? Our hybrid event. You want to talk about that?
Well, so we did. So it was basically the idea of it is that our team is very interested in getting engineers to talk about what engineers want to talk about. One of the challenges in sort of working for a big company, especially when the company does events, is that often you will find that we need to talk about what's new just so that we get the awareness out there of what's new and people know what's coming. But as Sonia alluded to, and one of the things I've been very big on is it's very clear that we don't all live at the cutting edge. In fact, we often live far behind it. And the further we are from working in an IT company, and I started at a university and then worked for an industrial metals company as a network administrator, trying to get them, and this was in the early 2000s, and I was like, you need to move to Windows 2000. And they were like, we're fine with NT4. NT4 is not broken. It does what we need it to do. And if you're working in IT beyond the small parts of the world that's technology companies, you're then suddenly dealing with a mentality of, if it's not broke, we don't need to replace it. So what our hybrid event was, and coming back to that idea, is obviously a lot of Microsoft engineers have got a broad spectrum and some really insanely deep knowledge about stuff that's not cutting edge. And it doesn't mean that the stuff that's not cutting edge is not interesting. It's just that when you think about where a lot of the audience is, a lot of the audience is a bit behind the cutting edge, and they're wanting to know, for example, if you're going to talk about authentication, they want to know about what's going on with authentication from what we've learned. We don't need to know about the brand spanking new stuff. That's very interesting. But what can you tell us about our current environment? What can you tell us about what we've got, not what we might have in a few years' time? So the idea of the event was that we approached engineers within Microsoft that we'd worked with in the IT pro space. And we said, okay, the only hook we want to come in is it has to have something in some way to do with hybrid. But our approach to hybrid has very much been, don't think of hybrid as a transitional state. Think of these organizations where you're trying to make the argument, why should we do some cloud? And it's like, because this bit of cloud, this small bit of cloud over here, makes everything that we've got enhanced. It makes it better. We're not going to replace it. We're just going to plug something in from the cloud. And, you know, one of the easiest sells on that is to talk about Azure File Sync. Why? Because Azure File Sync solves problems that everybody who's an IT pro has had with a file server, which is the damn things fill up all the time. Replications always is nasty. There's always conflicts and things like that. And it's difficult to make sure that they're backed up, because if you muck out the file server, well, that's great until you get someone turns up and says, oh, I had a file there 3 years ago and I really need it now. Where's it gone? And you know where it's gone. It's sitting in a backup tape, you know, in some vault somewhere. So anyway, so the idea of the event is we said to these engineers, we'd like you to talk about what you think the audience wants to talk about, rather than, you know, what necessarily the cutting edge thing you're working about. What's your topic that you've been noodling over for a while, that you can do a 300, 400, 500 level session on? And the way that we structured the event was, instead of and this is a challenge of online events are very much, you have almost a lecture classroom still approach. And that doesn't work for online very well as a presenter, because you're talking to a webcam and you're not getting that audience feedback, but also from the audience perspective, because you don't feel that you're engaged. If you're in a room with someone and they're making eye contact with you, you're there, you're being drawn back in. And that's a speaker technique, to make eye contact with people, because then they're feeling connected to you. So what we decided to play with was, we'd go with these deep dive technical talks, but then we'd have presenters like Sonia and myself with the speaker, and we would be the voice of the audience, but we'd also be a proxy for the audience, so that instead of it just being a pure one-way street, we'd actually have an ongoing conversation at a deep level with the speaker. And instead of it being like a panel session where you get someone up on the stage going, I've got dumb question, here's dumb question, what's your short answer? It was like, now let's have a teaser and let's go off down that garden path as far as the garden path goes, knowing that we can pull it back. We also said, take as long as you like. We're not going to lock you into 30 minutes. We're not going to lock you into 60 minutes. If you want to go for 1 hour and 40 minutes, awesome. So that was our event. And you can find the links to the sessions for those events. Is it itopstalk.com, or did we have an academic?
So I've just dropped the link in the chat. It's aka.ms/itopstalks, and I've dropped the link in the chat as well. We are probably going to carry on down this path of some of the content that we cover, but I'm interested, people in the audience, are you running a hybrid environment? Do you have some capabilities that you're using in the cloud and some stuff that you have on-prem? And if you do, what are the challenges that you found with having these workloads in different places? Because we can certainly address some particular points if there's anything that you want to bring up. I love the format. It was very different than anything that we've ever tried before. And that was the great part about it, was to be able to go off and do an experiment. But the topics themselves just were fascinating to me. It's that, you know, when you're sitting in a conference room and you hear a real expert talking and going deep on one particular thing, and you've chosen to watch that session because that's what you're interested in, we just had some real gems of stuff. I want to, let's pick on Steve Seifus. So if you don't follow Steve Seifus on Twitter, he does these amazing Twitter threads about different parts of the authentication process and kind of the mechanics of what happens behind the scenes. So we went, wouldn't that be really cool to do as a talk, give Steve some time to noodle through some of those specifics. And not only did we get Steve talking in session Ops 108, Windows authentication internals in a hybrid world. So not only did he step us through the process of what actually happens behind the scenes when you sit at your Windows computer and you log in, and you get, nowadays you get to your desktop pretty quickly, but there's all this magic like going on in the background for the authentication processes. But he sort of started out of, well, this is kind of the simplest form of how Active Directory handles it when you're in a domain joined environment and you're just accessing on-prem resources, right through to, well, what happens if there's some cloud stuff in there and I've got, you know, single sign-on? How does the computer then go and do the authorization so you've got access to the cloud stuff as well? So it was a really good, not only the mechanics of in the background, but the evolution of that process as these environments have become more complicated and we've got these different factors that have come in. Suzanne said that she's mostly cloud-based, but most have on-prem AD synced. Yeah, most of your customers. So that's a very common thing where we're finding. One that you might be interested in then is Ops 106 on how to be an AD hybrid health hero. So Mark Morozinski and Grace Picking talk about some of the different methods of you connecting your on-prem identity to the cloud, not so much in terms of which one you should choose or how you should set them up, but when they are in place and they're running, what should you be doing to monitor the health of those, checking for sync errors? What sort of things should you have in place to make sure that that's all configured correctly and it's kept healthy? And theirs was a really good session too. Orin, what did you think? What were some of your favourites?
Well, one of the things that's good about that event, and one of the things I wanted to drag it back to, is all of us inner geeks really sometimes like getting down into the details of what's going on. And what can happen a little bit is that because some of the technology does work sometimes very quickly and easily, we don't drill down like we might have. I know that when I got started in the 90s, you had these huge resource kits, and we were going through the process of, how a Kerberos ticket worked and all of these aspects of authentication. And it's interesting in how much we abstract away our level of understanding when we get something handed to us on a plate and it's very simple. But our role as experts does sort of require us at some stage to actually just go down and have a look at what the heck's going on with all of this stuff. And that was what we were trying to bring back with this event, rather than this sort of rushed infomercial type approach to how do you do this? Or, we're going to talk you through in 30 minutes how you enable FIDO authentication in a hybrid environment. You can do that, but when you get someone who sits there and goes, right, this is actually what's going on, you gain a better understanding, because the cognitive model that you're building in your head suddenly becomes a lot deeper than a surface level understanding. And our job is to have that deeper level of understanding at a certain point in time, so that when we are trying to troubleshoot things, when we're trying to understand an architecture, we're actually pulling things together in our mind rather than just going, press button A, get result B.
Yeah, absolutely. Jess, what do you find for customers that you work with in terms of this hybrid concept?
I'm yet to see any customer that is purely cloud-based. I haven't dealt with a customer that is 100% cloud. Most of my customers are hybrid. They are planning on staying hybrid for an extended period of time. It's not, as Orin said, it isn't a transition phase. This is just the way we operate. We have stuff on-prem, we have stuff in private clouds, we have stuff in other public clouds. It's a sort of a mish of all sorts of stuff. But I like what Orin was saying in terms of, we can tell people how to do things. Like, it's very easy for us to be able to say, here, go to this learn content or go to this docs document, and it will walk you through how to do everything. But it's that deeper understanding of how the technology actually works and what's going on behind the scenes that a lot of people kind of need to be able to understand the tech that they're using, because they want to get that bigger picture of, yes, I'm turning on MFA, but what is that actually doing? What is the authentication flow that goes behind that? How does it actually operate, so that when things break, you understand where you need to look to fix it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the strongest skills that an IT pro can build is enough understanding so that when you run into a problem, you can discount the things that are obviously not going to work or not going to be relevant. I mean, you go to a search engine and you type in the error message you've got or some of the symptoms, and just the ability to look through that page of search results and to go into some of the things that you find in there and go, that's not quite what I've got, or no, I don't think that's, that's a skill that I think people underestimate and undervalue when they think, well, it's all online. Like, you just Google these error codes and you find the answers, don't you? I'm like, yes, not quite that simple.
And like, Google Foo is a thing, but there is like I would say you almost need like a master's in Google Foo. Like, there is a separate level of getting to it.
There's the challenge that we have with understanding is that in the past, there was more of a barrier, or there was more friction, and knowledge only sticks with you if there's a bit of friction anyway. But you need to be able to differentiate wheat from chaff. And if you've only learned to problem solve by search engine queries, and you haven't actually engaged that information at a deeper level, you can't do the check on the knowledge to actually understand whether or not the person who's on the forum that you're looking at, who's got the problem that they think they've solved, is actually blowing bubbles or is actually onto something solid. Because it's like when you go and hire a tradie and the tradie comes and you don't know if the tradie's done a good job or not, because you don't know anything about what the tradie does. Well, as being the tradie in this particular case, your job is you're trying to solve a problem, and at a certain level, you can't just be superficial with your knowledge. And knowledge is not the ability, and people often mistake this. People mistake knowledge for being able to find information. Being able to find information today is easy. Being able to assess the quality of information is a skill that's developed over a lifetime. Because I used to do, and you know, both of you have seen it, I used to do my 30 Terrible Habits of Systems Administrators session. And one of the ones in there was who has basically Googled something because they're desperate, looked at the result, had no idea if it's going to work, but they were so desperate that they said, hey, we'll put it into production. And people do that. Now, there's a slight sanity check on, is this going to break? But there's not a law of unintended consequences check where you suddenly realize that the thing you did, oh, heck, no, oh. So again, this is why we've got to, and I see it with people. I mean, there's memes that are jokes. I'm a good IT pro. I know how to use Google, and it's or Bing. Sorry, Thomas, if you're watching this, I did come back from brand. But it's the ability to assess the information that you have returned, and people forget that part of it. And there's even been cognitive tests of people about, do you know a subject? And it wasn't that people understood something. It was just that they believed they understood it because they remembered how to find an answer to that question. And there's a difference between finding an answer and knowing the answer's right. And luckily, I mean, I find that a lot just in when you have to write a lot, you actually have to go a lot beyond that, because you're obviously not sitting there going, well, you know what, I'll put in my book, I'll put in this first thing that I found. Because I found once when I was writing a book and I was stymied on a subject, I turned to a search engine and I put in the terms of the subject, and the result I got was a pre-print of the table of contents of the book that I was writing. So there was no resource on the internet about this topic. And when I tried to Google it, so to speak, I got the book and I said, if I click on that link, will the chapter already be written for me? No, I had to go to the product team and ask.
And okay, so let's go down that path then. How do you pick up those skills for a hybrid environment? Because one of the things that I see for software developers, for example, is we're teaching kids to code, and then we turn around and tell them, like, go and spin up an Azure free trial and like scaffold up some applications in the cloud, and that's fairly easy to do. But if I'm a sysadmin who's been working in an organization with a very historic, complicated on-prem environment, and either I want to learn some cloud skills, or the organization has tasked me with looking at implementing it and using some of these cloud resources, it's a little bit scary because I generally don't usually have access to a full test environment that mimics my production environment. So a lot of the times when I turn on something in the cloud and I connect it to production, I haven't really had much of a test bed for that. And it's different than just going into Azure and firing up a virtual machine. I guess I've had the luxury of having hardware that's grunty enough that I can create a Windows server locally as a virtual machine, and that can be, in essence, my pretend domain controller for connecting up to the cloud. But how do people start to build those skills for a cloud or a hybrid world?
So one of the interesting things is today, of course, that it's a lot easier to get the hardware that can spin up multiple virtual servers, because it's not like 20 years ago when 512 meg of RAM was a lot. You can go and buy an off-the-shelf laptop now that has 32 or 64 gig of RAM. Probably not so much the 64, but it's starting to have that. I've got a Lenovo that's got 128 gig of RAM. However, what I'm coming back to is that the server footprint, as long as you throw, about 800, 900 meg at a server, you can run Windows Server, you can certainly run Linux boxes, and you can pretty much every laptop these days, or pretty much every computer that anybody buys can host virtual instances anyway. The trick is that even when we were resource constrained, the people that learnt the best were the ones that were going off and finding some way to build their own lab. They were finding, I started learning in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne, and we had no budget whatsoever for that. So we would literally find old computers that might be retired from the lab or something like that, and then just put them together, and it ran like a dog. But you could run NT4 on a 48633 if you pushed hard enough, and it didn't run well, but that's what I started studying NT4 server on. It was an awful experience, and it was much better on the hot DX266. You're probably looking at me like going, what's a 486? It's what happened before a Pentium after a 386.
I used to support 286s and 386s, so I'm also old. We're good.
Well, I wasn't going to go there, but anyway. But people, especially in ops, don't worry, Suzanne. Of course, I know that about showing my age. I have an 18-year-old. I am reminded on a regular basis that people who are over 25 are old, that Britney Spears is classic rock, and that 2015 was a long, long time ago. And he's bigger than me, so I can't choke him to death. But other than that, what I'm coming back to is that a lot of people when there's a will, there's a way. And there's a lot of old hardware about, and any version of Windows Server will run on any computer, basically, that's been produced, or Linux will run. Like, you can run Linux, obviously, on a Raspberry Pi, and you can teach yourself a heck of a lot of Linux just by buying a Raspberry Pi and plugging it in. But you've got to make, the best way to learn for almost everybody is to do. And one of the things that is interesting, and I've always wondered about, and I don't have a good answer for this, is being an IT pro more of a trade than, we call it a profession, but if you think about what a profession is in terms of traditionally, in terms of doctors and accountants and things like that, there is a lot more trial and error and learning particular techniques and particular skills on the job, in our job, than there is just learning a whole lot of theory. You don't do a 3-year university course and then come out knowing how to troubleshoot Active Directory replication effectively. You know how to start, or you know how to start doing. So it's a lot of doing by learning, and again, then digging down where you need to understand more. And with hybrid, that's very much the case. You can spin up a free trial and you can try bits and pieces, but before you got a lot out of hybrid, you'd want to know your on-prem skills. You'd want to know the basics of, for example, how to use, in our world, Active Directory. How do you use a user? How do you use a group? How do you reset a password? How do you make an account expire? How do you force someone to change their password? How do you determine who hasn't logged on in a long time? That's just starting with Active Directory. How do you set up a file server? How do you set permissions for a file server? Because we know from our own practice, most people can't do file server permissions, can they? It's just basically open to the world, or the help desk is getting too many calls about not being able to access files.
Yeah, absolutely. Jess, I've got a question for you. Do you see, without naming names, do you see a phenomenon where people who have a strong on-prem background take some of the baggage with them in terms of how they think of the cloud? And I'm going to phrase it like that. I'm actually drafting up an article for a Cloud Guru on the differences between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, and kind of explaining the differences between those two. But I think there is a propensity maybe for people to think that the cloud is another data center, and that the way that they manage and secure things like Windows Server or access to files, or they manage identities, because they've got all of this prior knowledge of what they've always done, they kind of struggle to apply that to the cloud, because they're like, well, how do I do the equivalent of group policy? Like,
yeah, and there is a lot of this is the way I've always done it, so this is the way I'm always going to do it. So particularly when it comes to that mindset of migrating to the cloud, it's, I have these servers that are on-prem. I'm going to pick them up and move them across and put them straight into Azure as virtual machines. There's not a lot of consideration from some people around, how can I do this better? What are the ways that I can utilize this new technology to be able to then make this either run more efficiently or run more effectively? Now, that's not to say that running something in a VM isn't the way to do it. That could very easily be the best way to do it, but there's not even an approach to taking a look at it and seeing whether there is another way of doing it. The same goes from a security perspective as well. So looking at it from the security aspect of, this is what we've always looked at in terms of security, and predominantly that's that network. The network is your boundary. It's your perimeter. That's what you have to protect. Whereas now there's a big shift to, you need to protect your identities, and trying to shift that mindset is very, very hard in that hybrid world.
Although one of the things I come back to, and it's a challenging thought for a lot of people in the technology industry, when we talk about, oh, there's a better way to do it. And the question is it really? Is it more effective, or does it just feel, do we not know what the problems are? And that there's a whole set of different problems that you've got with hybrid compared to on-prem. And then suddenly, one of the things that you see often with people who are using a replication from an on-prem identity to the cloud is that they still do most of their user management on-prem, simply because they find that the tools, we know how the tools work. And the analogy I like to use is, we've got excellent game controllers these days, but do you notice that we still steer our cars with an invention that was made 120 years ago? And why is that? Because it does the job in a way that's very reliable, that doesn't have all of the, with a game controller, you run out of power. When there's a mechanical thing there, you've always got a level of control, even if the power goes out or whatever, then there's all of these failures. So one of the things that we need to always be cognizant of is, sometimes when it seems that people are being recalcitrant about moving to a new technology, it's because they understand that there are traps involved in moving into any new technology, and that while it might solve some problems that they've got on-prem, or some problems that they've got with the old technology, it might introduce some more complicated problems that they don't have. For example, and another example of this would be Apollo versus the space shuttle. The Apollo rockets were really, really good at getting people up there, and the Russians kept their space programs. The Americans came along and did the space shuttle, which was a whole lot newer and a whole lot more technically complicated. But in the end, the old Russian rockets were just a much more reliable way, and they were still getting people up to the space station, even though it was 1960s technology, because the new way of doing things turned out to have a whole lot of side effects, and it was a lot more expensive than the old way of doing things.
Oh, yeah. And especially when it comes to when you're talking about keeping your users and managing all of your users on-prem, I'm still seeing that is the way a lot of organizations are doing it. They're not utilizing Azure AD as their single point of identity management. Their on-prem AD is where they do all of that. And that comes down to not just the ease and the understanding of the tool, but also because they're still doing stuff on-prem that doesn't connect up to Azure Active Directory. So they want that local point of contact. I like Bronwyn's point, though, that she's put in. I see it so often is that they've got traffic going out into the cloud, and then it comes back on-prem, and you're like, no, don't do that, for the love of God. So I think there is like a middle ground of trying to work out where that balance is. You were saying that a lot of the time, the people who are saying, no, we don't want to necessarily move to that technology, is because they're seeing that there could be problems that are unforeseen. At the same time, I do see that a lot of the people who don't want to move to the cloud, it's purely of, I know this thing and I don't want to have to learn something new. So it's a mixture of both.
Well, so one of the things that we have to understand, one of the things we're all cognizant of, I should say, is that the biggest source of cost overruns for most modern businesses is IT projects. So having gone through transitions from, for example, NT to 2000 to virtualization, where we've seen what we said were going to be the benefits versus the costs. At a certain point, a tractor plows fields or a tractor is used to do something. And a solution has to be an order of magnitude better for it to be worth sometimes the pain of transition. And when we're living on the cutting edge, we always say faster, better, like a Daft Punk song. But
too soon, Orin. Too soon, buddy. Too soon. They just announced this week that they have broken up after like 28 years.
But what I'm saying with that is that we need to be cognizant as people who obviously live out on the cutting edge of how other people think about organisational technological change. Just because so much in the past organisational technological change has been not done well. And there's a great example with the IRS in the US, where the IRS in the US is still relying on a 1960s code base for certain functions. Now, the reason for that is that everybody comes along every few years and says, we're going to redo all of this IT infrastructure. And they go and redo it, and they only do cover 95% of the functionality of the previous thing. And then they introduce like 20 or 30% new functionality. But it's that 5% that doesn't get covered. So they have to keep the old code around to do that 5%. And they've never been able to retire the old code base. And it's a matter of understanding everything that the old thing did before adopting the new one. And I think that anybody who's stayed in IT more than 5 years has to love learning. I always push back against this. No, people don't want to learn the new thing, because obviously we go out and speak at technical events, and anybody who goes to a technical event is self-selecting as interested in new technology, and anybody that goes to a user group. But every time I've seen pushback against something, it's this doesn't solve the problems that I've got, or this might introduce problems that I don't want to be sitting there holding the bill for a project that, the last time we adopted something new, it might have worked, but it might have cost a lot more, and it didn't actually, again, everybody remembers trying to get people to move from Windows XP to Vista. And there were really good technical arguments to do that. A lot of people weren't having a bar of it either, were they? So, we always, when someone pushes back against something, always try and figure out what are they pushing back against, and is it rational? And there will be irrational pushback, but one of the things that we never talk about is the costs of these transitions, and also just simply explaining it, because I remember trying to explain why we should go to Windows 2000 from NT to a company that was like, everything works. Why do we need group policy? What problem are you actually solving that we've got? Or are you just wanting to play with the new technology? And 25-year-old Orin had to kind of admit that maybe he just wanted to play with the new technology.
I like Melina has dropped in the chat asking, in relation to hybrid, have you seen many or any clients choose to return to private cloud or internal data centers after going hybrid? Jess, you said no, and I just want to add that it's something that we are starting to see a slight increase of, is people looking at things like Azure Stack. So instead of having this on-prem or cloud, they're looking at things like Azure Stack to actually get some cloud services, but still in their own data center. I don't think I've ever seen anyone pull out after the effect, though, and you mentioned that too, Jess.
For me, I've seen a number of customers who hit bill shock. So bill shock is certainly a thing that some people have been hit with when it comes to Azure, particularly when it comes from my side, when I'm looking at stuff, security, they're like, put up all the things. And I'm like, are you sure? And they get hit with a little bit of bill shock. So it comes down to, if you're going to be moving up into the cloud, making sure you understand how to do that cost optimization, else you will be sort of, oh my God, no, we don't want to touch that, pulling back. But even those ones who have received that god-awful bill shock, they still have workloads that they're running up there, because there are things that they can do up in the cloud that they couldn't do on-prem, or they found there are things that they could do more effectively up in the cloud that they weren't doing as effectively on-prem. So even those kind of situations, we're still seeing people, they might not have as much up there as they first had, but they still have stuff up there. They're still existing in that hybrid state.
There's also a segment of customers that are starting to use the cloud as their dev environment, because they can scale to whatever needs and they can play around with all of the stuff. But then when they actually run it, they bring it down and run it on-prem. And so there was a customer that it was essentially looking at Kubernetes, and they did their development of their Kubernetes application up in the cloud, but it needed to be down on-prem because ultimately it was dealing with on-prem stuff, and all of their data centers were on-prem, but they found it much better to do the development in the cloud, get it all right, use as much infrastructure as they want, and then when they got it right, that was dev, prod was on-prem. And I think that that's also one of those areas because where the cloud makes a lot of sense to people, because we know, and Jess has told the story a million times of when she was going around retiring 2003 servers because she didn't know who owned what. Now, sometimes you would have been dealing with test servers that were spun up and the project died and no one knows what happened. Now, if those test servers are sitting in the cloud, at least they're not consuming, if you be as efficient as possible on-prem because you are really capacity constrained, because extending capacity on-prem involves capital expenditure. But on the cloud, you can be a little more free with the dev environment because you know that you can blow it away, pull it back, blow it away, pull it back, and you're not going to end up with this, cluster of VMs that no one knows where they live because their developers just spanned them up and left them there and then forgot about them. And even the developer, you're going, what does that do? And they're like, oh, I don't know, it's one of mine because it's named after, one of the Muppets, but not entirely sure what it does, but Ralph is definitely one of the Muppets.
Oh, look, I just love the fact that if they're going to go start spinning stuff up in the cloud, I could use Azure policy to enforce that they have to tag it with like owner or creator or alias or something where they're forced to put a name in. Hopefully they put in their own name, so at least I know who owns the damn cloud resource if I want to delete it.
And there's the policy that you can then utilize those tags to say, look, this environment, you've said it's a dev server, which means policy is also going to enforce that it gets shut down every night at 6 p.m.
Yeah. All right, I'm conscious of time. Orin, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to end just with a couple of notices. We have upcoming events. So Microsoft Ignite is next week, the new Spring Ignite. Yes, I know it's not spring in Australia, but they're calling it Spring Ignite in Redmond. That goes live next week. It's the first time that they've ever done an Ignite that is kind of in the middle of the year, because remember we had one at the end of last year. The session scheduler is live. I'm dropping a link in the chat to myignite.microsoft.com if you want to go register and check that out. I was in the session scheduler yesterday and there were quite a few on-demand sessions in there that I've added to my backpack, which means I can go and view them at whatever time I want. But yeah, so that's on next week. Our next Women IT Pros call is on the 25th of March. So sticking to our last Thursday of the month, the cadence, same bat time, same bat channel. We're talking about modernization next month. So this whole thing about the fact that IT Pro is a very legacy skill and we're all doing things the same way that we've been doing them for the last 20 years. Why don't we get with the program and modernize and turn everything into infrastructure as code and get with the program? So we're going to have an attempt at kind of smashing that myth, but talking about what actually is useful when we're thinking about modernizing our processes and practices. And it kind of does link back to that tenet that Orin was talking about finding the nuggets of what is helpful as opposed to what's just the buzzword of the day, that we should all be deploying everything through GitHub. So modernization is next month's topic. I'll get that up on Eventbrite. It'll be the same join link for the online event. Thank you very much, Orin, for joining us.
Thank you.
Stay empowered.
Thanks for your time too, Jess. Everybody have a fantastic rest of your day, and we'll catch you next month.